It is the Christmas season, and we have a Christmas story in Genesis chapter 29. Now, you might look at that and say, I don't see anything about Christmas in Genesis 29. But if Jacob doesn't marry the daughters of Laban, there'll be no Christmas. Because this is all part of God's plan in bringing the Messiah. Don't ever lose the sort of the main storyline of the Bible. It's about redemption. It's about God bringing His anointed one into the world. And Genesis shows us exactly the way God in His sovereign plan is orchestrating that to bring about the Messiah. So you've studied in Genesis about Jacob and Esau. Jacob, the younger, is the child of promise, just as his father Isaac was a child of promise. It wasn't Esau. And now the storyline, so you've got in the book of Genesis, the story is about Abraham, and then it's about Isaac, and then it's about Jacob. So we're in that Jacob narrative. In chapter 28, you have Jacob's dream. God appears to him there. And now in chapter 29, so he has left the land where he's grown up, and he's returning back to the land of his mother. You remember the story of Abraham sending his servant to find a bride for Isaac, and where he went was where now Jacob is going. He's going to go back to the land of his uncle Laban, that is Rebekah's brother. So read with me beginning in Genesis chapter 29 and verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it, for out of that well the flocks were watered. Now, if you've ever watched the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and if you haven't watched it, you're culturally deprived. You must watch Lawrence of Arabia. But one of the main scenes, and so Lawrence takes off when he leaves Cairo, and he's going across, he's trying to find King Faisal, and he has a Bedouin take him to King Faisal, and along the way they stop at a well. And they water themselves at this well, and when as they're there sort of reclining at the well, it's out in the middle of the desert, and David Lean, the director, does this well. On the horizon, you see a tiny little speck, and in a moment you can see the speck grow, and you can tell that it's a man riding on a camel. And if I'm not mistaken, the whole scene of the guy and it's what's his name? I'm blank on the actor's name. Omar Sharif, thank you. Omar Sharif on the camel, and David Lean takes a full minute and a half you're watching this camel cross the desert. You see the mirages and everything, and as soon as Omar Sharif gets there, he kills the guy that Lawrence is with. He just shoots him. And Lawrence says, basically, what are you doing? And he said he was drinking at my well, at our well. This is a Huttite well. It's not. He's not one of us. He doesn't get to drink at this well. And that is precisely the way it is with wells out in the Arabian desert. Everybody knows whose well it is. It might belong to a particular community, but outsiders don't just come up to the well. And here you see, here's Jacob. He's coming from afar. He gets there, and there are 3 flocks of sheep. Now, you and I might wonder how you know 3 flocks of sheep from 1 flock of sheep. But clearly you've got shepherds there. They've arranged their sheep. And the way this well is, there's a massive stone over it. So not just anybody can get water out of it. It takes effort. And the way it works is they come and they will roll the stone away and they'll water their sheep. So Laban gets there in the middle of the day, and there are 3 flocks of sheep, the stone across the mouth of the well. And verse 3, when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. You got to protect the water supply from enemies poisoning it or stealing your water. And one of the ways that you protect your home, you can't have marauding bands coming around the desert because they got to have water. And one of the ways that you keep any kind of marauders away from your flocks is you control the water source. So water is everything. Water is life in the desert. And Jacob comes here and he sees this community has a well. And he says to them, my brothers, where do you come from? They say, we're from Haran. He said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? They said, we know him. He said to them, is it well with him? They said, it is well. Excuse me. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. Funny you should mention him. Here comes his daughter with the sheep. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing because we know from the rest of the text that Laban has sons, but they're not tending the sheep. His daughter's tending the sheep. And again, you can only see in this the orchestrating hand of God that he has Rachel there. And he says to them, behold, it's still high day. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. They said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. So Jacob started trying to tell them their business. And he's like, well, go ahead, water sheep, go put them out to pasture. And I think the implication here is he's wanting to talk to Rachel alone. He's trying to get rid of them. But while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the mouth's well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. This is, it's always an interesting thing when you run into somebody you're sort of kin to or you know. And you can imagine Rebekah has no clue who he is. Tanya and I were in Hawaii a few months back, and we were at the place where we stay, and we were out by the swimming pool. Not many out there that day. One reason we like to go to the Big Island is there aren't many people there. It's not like Honolulu where all kinds of people. We're there by the pool, and there's this other couple near us. Not many people out there, but this couple we started talking to. And I noticed immediately they had northern accents. And so eventually I said, hey, where are you guys from? And they said, well, we're from Michigan. I said, interesting. I said, what part of Michigan? They said, well, we're from the Detroit area. I said, well, what part of Detroit? They said, the guy said, well, we live in Clinton Township, but I grew up in Warren. I said, well, what high school? He said, you're kidding. I said, no, what high school? He said, Lincoln High School. I said, are you Kevin Summers' brother? He said, no, Kevin Summers was my brother. And I went to high school with this guy. Didn't even recognize him. He was 2 years ahead of me. He had a brother in my grade that I knew well. And, it's just a weird experience. You're there and like, hey, we know each other. We went to the same school. And you have that with Jacob and Rebekah. Here, she brings the flock, and this guy whom she's never seen, this is a tight-knit community. You know everybody. You know everybody's sheep, everybody that's tending the sheep. And this guy whom she's never seen rolls away the stone, and he waters her sheep. Now, that's unusual. And then he comes over her, and he kisses her. This would be a greeting kind of a kiss. And he tells her who he is. I'm your kinsman. I'm Rebekah's son, your aunt's son. And immediately she takes off and runs to tell Laban, her father. Now, hospitality in the Middle East is a big thing. And so here's a kinsman who's come to them. She wants to tell her father so that arrangements can be made. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to the house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Now, again, this wouldn't be unusual. Hospitality would be extended, and Jacob would live there as a member of the household. No doubt he would help with the chores and tending the sheep and all that. And verse 15, after a month, Laban said to Jacob, "Because you're my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now, in light of the way Laban's character unfolds, I can't read this any other way than rather disingenuous, because Laban is always looking to take advantage of somebody. He's not being generous here. He's allowed, by the way, just notice that he's allowed Jacob pretty much to work for him for a month before he has this conversation. So that says something. But he says to him, just because you're kin to me doesn't mean you should work for nothing. What would you like for your wages? And I think what Jacob answers must have shocked him. Now, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak. Now, what does this mean? It can be translated soft or weak. And it could mean she had poor eyesight. It could mean, it could be speaking of their appearance. It could be that they were much lighter than other people in her family. So there's something about her eyes or her eyesight that attract attention. And it's not necessarily positive attention. I think that there's something about Leah's eyes that set her apart, and not in a positive way. So, in other words, she's not the more attractive of the 2. At least she doesn't fit his idea of what a beautiful woman is. Leah's eyes were weak, but that's why, again, we're not exactly sure what it means that her eyes were weak or soft. But it clearly puts her in a category in Jacob's mind that makes her not as attractive as Rachel. But Rachel was beautiful, look at this, in form and appearance. I think this is one of only 2 women in the Bible that the Bible talks about her figure. The other one being Esther. And here it is. She was beautiful in form and appearance. So her face is beautiful. Her figure is beautiful. Jacob is smitten. And in fact, it says Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Now, Jacob's name means trickster, deceiver. But when Jacob's in love, there's nothing deceptive about him. In fact, he doesn't even drive a hard bargain. He's not saying, he doesn't start with a low figure. Well, if I tend your sheep, let me have Rachel. He leads with a big number. I'll work for her 7 years. Now, this is unusual because, first of all, a father wants to marry off his oldest daughter first. Because if he doesn't, then she'll look like nobody wants her, and it'll be harder to marry her off. It just creates family tensions and problems. And so Jacob says, "I want to marry Rachel, the youngest daughter." Perhaps it's because she's the younger. He offers such a large number of years. He said, "I'll work for her for 7 years." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. And look at this phrase, they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. I love that verse. What's the best way to enjoy working for the Lord? It's to fall in love with the Lord. What's the best way to enjoy marriage? It's to really love your spouse. When you love somebody, you know, the investment you have to make is really a small thing because of the love you have. And really, this is the way our work for the Lord should be. Because we love the Lord so much, it's easy to work for him. It's a, it's a good thing to work for him. And, you know, I've served the Lord my entire adult life, and frankly, I look back at the time and go, where did it go? It's gone quickly. And I think that's a joyful thing. It's not a drudgery. I always feel sorry for people who get up and hate their job. I know there are an awful lot of people who hate their job, but they have to do it in order to put food on the table. I'm blessed that my job has been serving the Lord, whom I love. And that should be the heart of a Christian. Whatever we do to make a living, serving the Lord should be a joy because we love him. And Jacob loved Rachel. He was willing to work for 7 years for her. He loved her so much that it seemed but a few days, even though it was 7 years. So at the end of the 7 years, Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. Now, I like to think about this time. How do you think Rachel looks at Jacob during those 7 years? Man, you see this guy working his tail off every day, and you know he's doing that because he wants you. What an incredible prelude to marriage. And she knows this man loves me. And look at him. He's working for me. For 7 years, he's working for her. And at the end of that 7 years, Jacob says, okay, my time is completed. I've done what I promised. Let me have my wife now. And Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. So this is the way you celebrate a marriage. You have a party, a wedding feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Now, this is sort of hard for us to imagine because we go, how does a guy not know that he's with his girlfriend's sister instead of her? But in those ancient Near Eastern customs, first of all, there would not have been much light in the evening like that. And this was a tender time. Man is going into his wife for the first time, and she probably was bejeweled and bedecked with a veil. And Leah, of course, she's in on this with her dad because she probably resents that her younger sister is being married before she is. I mean, you think about it. Jacob's been working for 7 years for Rachel, and nobody's shown up in those 7 years saying, let me have Leah. So Leah and Laban, they have this worked out, and she, no doubt, uses her feminine wiles to make sure that Jacob, who after 7 years of working was no doubt ready for this marriage to be consummated, he's not expecting anything other than his wife, and they consummate the marriage. The morning comes, and he sees it's not Rachel for whom he worked for 7 years, it's her sister Leah. And it says in the evening he took his daughter Leah, brought her to Jacob, he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Well, there's an understatement. In the morning, behold, it was Leah. I imagine he did behold. who I just can't even imagine what he thought. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It's not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." Now, he could have made that argument 7 years earlier, but he did not. And again, here's where you see Laban's character. If there's anybody that is a trickster more than Jacob, it's Laban. He says, "It's not done like this. Complete the week of this one." Now, that word week means it's just the word for 7. And he says, "You complete the 7 for this one, and we'll give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." So it's debatable exactly what he's saying, but the ESV translates this by using the word week, so that their interpretation, and I think it's right, is that Laban is saying, all right, have a 1 week honeymoon with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel, and you go ahead and marry her, but then you work another 7 years. Now, again, you get in everybody's head in this story. I can't help but think about poor Leah. I say poor Leah. She's in on it, but man, what that must feel like. And she's going to carry that feeling her entire life, knowing she's not the one Jacob wanted. She's not the one that he really loves, even though she's going to bear him more children by far. But he says, so you spend a week with Leah, then I'll give you Rachel. You work another 7 years. And Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. Now, we're told about Zilpah and Bilhah because they're going to enter into it. They're going to become Jacob's concubines. They're going to bear sons to him as well. And they're part of the story. So Laban gives his daughters, and he gives each of his daughters a servant, and they become the wives of Jacob. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. And let's talk for just a moment about polygamy in the Bible, because every now and then this comes up in our discussions, contemporary discussions about marriage and the Christian view of marriage and the sanctity of marriage. And there are always people go, well, in the Bible they practice polygamy. How can you Christians argue that you believe in one man and one woman for life when your heroes in the Old Testament had multiple wives? Well, let me answer it in a couple of ways. One, let me give you a pragmatic argument. You can't show me a single example in the Old Testament where anybody practiced polygamy and it turned out well, where you got one big happy family. That does not happen. I mean, can you, man or woman, imagine sharing your spouse with someone else over the course of a lifetime? It's just unthinkable. Tanya York would kill both of us in our sleep. I'm convinced of it. Maybe not even in our sleep. I can't imagine it. Everywhere you see it, it's dysfunctional. There's jealousy. There's argument over who is loved the most, who gets to have the most children, who inherits. It's never a good thing. So pragmatically, I would argue, it never works. No one. Remember when it says in, I think it's 2 Samuel, that David and Jonathan loved each other more than they loved women? Well, why do you think that is? Because, and it's not, the interpretation the liberal crowd puts on that they're gay. That's obvious. That's not it at all. They have a singular love for each other when they have multiple wives. They got one best buddy, and they've got multiple women that are their wives. And so here's one person that fulfills a role in your life that no one else feels. And of course, you're going to feel an intimacy with that person. So David never has an intimate connection with a wife. I mean, again, it's just dysfunctional over and over and over. But so the one argument I would give is pragmatic. The other is what Jesus said. When they asked Jesus about divorce, what's his hermeneutic? He said, well, let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, it was not so. In the beginning, God created them male and female and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Now, I talked about this Sunday in the sermon. The one flesh principle is really the thing that should guide our understanding of marriage and sexuality. That's why there's no such thing as casual sex, because you become one flesh. Paul says if you have sex with a harlot, you've become one flesh with a harlot. And God's design is that this be an exclusive and intimate relationship that develops over a lifetime, so that you have genuine intimacy. And you can't have that with multiple women, certainly not at the same time. So in God's design and creation, he creates one man for one woman. Jesus reiterates that, Matthew 19. Also at the end of the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi, Malachi is rebuking the Jews who've come back from the exile for marrying pagan women just so they could get property. And he says to them, he says, so they had their Jewish wives, but then they would marry the daughter of a landowner so they could get property. And Malachi rebukes them. And he says that why did God make them one, like in the Garden of Eden? He says, did he not have, I remember the King James says, the residue of the Spirit. And remember that word ruach in Hebrew, the word translated spirit there is the same word for breath. And what Malachi is saying is that didn't God have breath left over? That he could have created two wives for Adam if he wanted to? He could have done that. He could have made that the standard. And yet he made them one. And why one, Malachi says? Because he desires a godly seed. And I would argue that even though God works through people whose lives are messed up, like polygamists in the Old Testament, it was never his design, it was never his plan, it was never his will. Just like everything else, God only uses sinners. He even works through our sin. That does not mean God purposes our sin, but the very fact that Tamar seduces Judah, and God used that, even though that was sin. But through Tamar's child comes the Messiah. And you see that in all of the genealogy of Jesus. So God uses sinful people, uses even our sinful deeds and rebellion to accomplish his purpose. His purpose is never thwarted because of our rebellion or sinfulness. And you see that played out over and over in the Old Testament. So here, Jacob, he's married to both of them, but the whole time he loves Rachel. Leah knows it. And he serves a total of 14 years for Rachel, and he had to be deceived to marry Leah. Now, just think how that played out at home between these two sisters. Not well. But now God is tender in his mercy and compassion toward Leah, the one who is unloved. Verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. Now, I'm going to go through these names quickly, and we're just going to summarize we're going to get through 11 sons and one daughter here in chapter 29 and 30. And in each case, you need to understand, I think I've explained to you before, like in Hebrew, you only have consonants, right? So like, all right, so in Hebrew, if I wanted to write the word Lincoln, I'd write it like that, but you'd have no idea how to pronounce it if you'd never heard it, because you don't know where the vowels go. And so I've heard Israelis pronounce it Lincoln, and they throw in extra vowels and whatever. So in Hebrew, you have words that have the same root, like the same three consonants, like a let's say I'm just gonna this word, the word for righteous or just or righteousness sort of looks like that, holy. But depending on what vowels I put in there and where I put them, you'll have a different word. Like this word could be tisk, it could be task. You just don't know, depending on where you put the vowels. Now, in these words, in these names that are given to these sons, each time they name the son, give him a name that sounds like, sort of has the same root as another word. Like I'll show you. So, verse 32, Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. Now, Reuben sounds like, look, a son. It's just got sort of different vowels. You've just sort of rearranged that same root. So it's not exactly look, a son, but it's got the same root. You with me? All you've done is sort of put in some different consonants. And that's what you've got for each of these sons. So when we say the name Reuben means look, a son, that's not exactly right. It sounds like that, and it's close to it. And they're doing word plays. Every time one of these children is born and they give them a name, it sounds like a word that they sort of commemorate how they're feeling at the time. So verse 33, she conceives again and bears a son, and she said, because the Lord has heard that I'm hated, he's given me this son also. And she named him Simeon. Simeon sounds like heard. Verse 34, she names this next one, we usually say Levi, but really in Hebrew it would be Levi. And Levi sounds like the Hebrew for attached, because she said, because I'm hated, the Lord's given me this son also that make my husband attached to me. Because I've borne him 3 sons. She conceives again, and she bores a 4th son, and she called his name Judah. And Judah sounds like the Hebrew word for praise, Yudah. And so you have 4 sons born in fairly quick succession by Leah. And what's happening with Rachel? Absolutely nothing. Now, we're pretty confident that he's having sex with her, but she's not conceiving. And Leah, who is rightly jealous because she knows that Jacob loves Rachel, now can be a little bit proud because she has children and Rachel does not. And in the ancient Near East, the greatest shame a woman could have, really, other than committing adultery, is being childless. And it was always the woman's fault in their mind. And we know modern science tells us that's not so, but it was really in the ancient world. And Leah can be very, very proud here. Now, Rachel sees that she's having no children, so she follows this ancient Near Eastern practice, again, it's sort of messed up, where you can have sex with my handmaid and her child is counted as mine. Now, it's a pure fiction that everybody knows better. And I would argue that it never felt that way really to the mother, because the fact that Rachel keeps trying to have children says something. But she has Jacob go into Bilhah, and Bilhah conceives and bears Jacob a son. In verse 6, Rachel said, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. So she called his name Dan, which sounds like judged. And Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, which sounds like wrestling. Now again, who's she trying to convince? She still had no children, and Leah has had 4. Her Bilhah, Rachel's maid, has had 2, and Rachel counts them as hers, but we know in subsequent history that that's just not so. And when Leah sees, well, if Rachel's doing that, then I'm going to trump her at that too. And so she gives Zilpah to Jacob, her handmaid. And Leah said, good fortune has come. She called his name Gad at the end of verse 11. Gad sounds like the Hebrew word for lucky, like a stroke of fortune. So Gad's name is lucky. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And she said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. Now in verse 14, you have this sort of strange story about Reuben, the oldest son, going out during the time of the wheat harvest. And he harvests some mandrakes. Now, if you've ever seen a mandrake root, they were used for seasonings and things. But a mandrake root looks like a human figure, specifically a man. It can have arms and legs, and in the ancient world, they thought this helped fertility. And Reuben gets these mandrakes, and he brings them, and Rachel thinks this will help me conceive. Now again, if you really counted your servant's children as your own, then that would be settled, right? But obviously, it's not the same. She still wants to have children. So she tries to make a deal to get some of the mandrakes from Reuben, Leah's son. And Leah says, basically, why should I let you have them? And she says, well, I'll make a deal with you. You can go in and spend the night with Jacob tonight if you let me have these mandrakes. Thinking, well, they'll still work for me in the long run. And apparently, based on the story, that hasn't been happening, right? If Leah is having relations with Jacob, she doesn't need to bargain with Rachel for it. So the fact that Rachel says, I can make this happen if you let me have these mandrakes, tells us it wasn't happening, and Rachel has incredible power over Jacob. Those are the two things that tells us. And so she makes the deal. And that night, Leah says to her, you must come into me, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. Now, again, let me just pause and say, does that sound like a normal family to you? Does that sound like polygamy is working? Everything about that is messed up. And so he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. So keep count now. Leah's had 4. And then Bilhah and Zilpah have each had 2. And now Leah has a 5th. So this brings the total to 9. She says, verse 18, God has given me my wages. Notice all the mercenary language here, how bad it is. So I have hired you for the night. I'm paying for you for the night. God has given me my wages because I gave my servant my husband. She calls his name Issachar. And then Leah conceived again. She bore Jacob a sixth son. She said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I've borne him six sons. So she called his name Zebulon, which sounds like the word for honor. After that, she gets pregnant again, but this time it's a girl, and she bores Dinah. So at this point, Jacob has 10 sons and one daughter, and Rachel has not had any children. Her handmaid has had 2, but she's had none. But now look at verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. I want to pause there just to point out to you that, again, one of the reasons why I believe in the sanctity of life from conception is that the biblical view is that God is the one who opens the womb. It says in the book of Ruth, God gave her conception. Here, God opened her womb. We see Sunday about John the Baptist in his mother's womb, even reacting to the entrance of Jesus. So the biblical view is that this is a child. God opens a womb. God gives the gift of life. And God is the one behind conception. It's why, quite frankly, and I know this is controversial, but to me, even in cases of rape, which is the most horrible circumstance you can think of, but if a sovereign God gives life, even in that horrible circumstance, the life that is given is not the punishment. The life that is given is not the crime. The life that is given should not be penalized because of the crime that precipitated the life. Now, that's the Catholic Church has taught that a long time. The pro-life movement, you might have disagreement about countries judicially granting exceptions. But as a Christian, my view is that all life comes from God. Whatever the circumstance that causes the life, people can have sex outside of wedlock, and that's a sin, but God still gives the life. Someone could be raped, and that's a horrible crime, but that's still a life. And I think to have a consistent view, life is life. An innocent life should not be taken because someone else committed a crime. And you just see this consistent view throughout the scriptures that God is the one who gives life. And all life comes from God. Whatever the circumstance on earth that precipitates the life, ultimately it comes from God. And when Leah's womb is opened, she said, God has taken away my reproach. And she calls his name Joseph, which means, it has a double meaning. It means may he add, but it also means taken away. So he's taken away my reproach, and may he add, may the Lord add to me another son. So even in the birth of Joseph, she has a prayer for another son. So Joseph is the 11th son, the 12th child, because you got Dinah. And now Jacob says, okay, it's time for me to leave. And God has prospered Jacob. And so he goes to Laban and he says, all right, I'm increased. I mean, at this point he's got 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 12 children. He says, it's time for me to go. But we need to figure out what are my flocks. And Jacob and Laban strike a deal that all the sheep that are speckled or striped will be his, and all the solid sheep will be Laban's. Well, Laban has his sons take away all the speckled and striped sheep and take them somewhere else so that they won't be a part of the bloodline. I mean, again, you see Laban trying to get the best of Jacob. He doesn't want him getting many of his flocks. So he tries to remove them so that they don't reproduce. You got this strange story now where Jacob takes sticks and things and he puts them where the animals water, and that when the animals come there to drink the water, they also breed. They're not being led through the countryside and you get watered, sated that way, and that's when the rams will mount the ewes. And he puts these stakes there at the watering trough. And now, this does not mean that if you do this, that you'll get the same result. This is just the Lord doing this for Jacob, that as the animals breed there in the presence of these, that when they're born speckled and striped. And his flocks grow greatly. And it said, verse 41, whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So what do you see here is God is prospering Jacob. Now, why is he prospering Jacob? And we want to conclude on this note. When you study Jacob and Esau, they always go together. And we're going to see that the theme of Jacob and Esau runs throughout Scripture. And particularly, you're going to hear the Lord say, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. The descendants of Esau are going to be cursed. They're going to be the Edomites. By the way, Herod the Great is a descendant of Esau. He's an Idumean. That's Idumea, Edom. All those are just corruptions of the word for the name for Esau. And they're a cursed people. And anytime you teach this, somebody always goes, man, why would God hate Esau? The big question, the much larger question is, why would God favor Jacob? Esau and Jacob are both morally challenged. They both have deficient characters in many ways. But God favors Jacob. He loves Jacob. He's chosen Jacob. And if that troubles you, then you need to ask yourself, does it bother you that God loves you? Because if God's going to love anybody, he's going to have to love somebody who's sinful. Because only Christ is free from sin. Remember, he's using sinful people in sinful circumstances to what? To bring the Messiah. That's the story. And that's really the story of God's grace. He's always using sinful people and sinful circumstances even to accomplish his purpose and his plan and his will. So here you've not had some big moral revival in Jacob. Jacob had the vision. He saw the ladder. But we don't see anything in these chapters about Jacob having a single-hearted devotion for God. But God has a single-hearted devotion for Jacob. That's the amazing thing. He relentlessly loves Jacob, even when Jacob blows it in so many ways. I mean, he's a polygamist. He doesn't pray for God to increase his flock. God just does it. And God is working to bring about his salvation. That is our only hope. The story of Jacob is the story of Hershael and the story of Dave and the story of Lester. It's all of our stories because we're sinners on whom God has shown his favor and loved us even when we didn't deserve it. And that is our only hope.